Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I am back for a second review of the Viltrox autofocusing 56mm f1.7 lens. So in this case, rather than for Fuji X-mount, which I reviewed back in April, we're taking a look at the new version just released for Sony E-mount. Now, Viltrox has been building in essentially two different directions. They've been going with more upscale lenses in one direction, but then also they have been moving from their kind of $300 range lenses also down into the between $100 and $200 with plastic construction, less features, but also there's a trickle-down effect from their excellent optical development that's been taking place. This lens is obviously from that category, and it is thus far the only APS-C lens in that series. So a 56mm f1.7 lens. Now, what I have found with the Sony E-mount version is essentially it solves almost all the problems with the Fuji X-mount version, because a lot of those problems tend to be somewhat specific to Fuji autofocus. So at a price tag of around or right under 180 US, is this a lens worth buying? Well, the answer is pretty clearly going to be yes, and we'll explain why in this review here. Now, 56mm on APS-C, so that's a 1.5 times crop factor on either Fuji or Sony, and so that gives you a full frame equivalent of about 84mm. So essentially an 85mm lens, a very popular angle of view. It's right under 30 degrees angle of view, so great for portrait work, for anything where you want kind of a short telephoto. This is the second 56mm lens from Viltrox. Their first was a 56mm f1.4. But if you take a look at this comparison that I've put together here, you can see that at the 80% level, how radically improved this new lens is over that original f1.4 lens. You'll find that with the original lens, there was almost nothing that ever reached that 80% threshold, whereas with the new lens, there's almost nothing that doesn't exceed the 80% threshold. So much, much sharper all across the frame, and most notably in the corners, where it's about 40% sharper than that previous lens. Now, as noted, this lens is not made out of metal. Initially, all Viltrox lenses were metal housing. They've gone to an engineered plastics here, but I will note that there's nothing about this lens that feels fragile. The original Samyang Tiny series, for example, they felt kind of flimsy, like if you squeezed them, they would flex a little bit. That's not the case here. These lenses actually feel really tough, and while it is plastic, it feels like the kind, I wouldn't recommend dropping lenses, but it feels like the kind of lens you could drop a few times and it actually would survive that experience. So f1.7 obviously is a unique aperture value, maximum aperture value, just a little bit brighter than f1.8. So f1.8 is 2/3 of a stop slower than what f1.4 is, thus 1/3 of a stop faster than f2. In this case, f1.7 is 1/2 stop. Rather than 2/3 stop slower than f1.4, this is 1/2 stop slower than f1.4. So just a tiny bit of an advantage, but it is a little bit of an advantage in that low light situations, you can suck in just a little bit more light than an equivalent f1.8 lens. Now, this lens is extremely compact, and while I did spend part of my time reviewing it on the APS-C mode of my A7R Mark V, which is my preferred APS-C body on Sony right now, but I also spent some time while I was doing my review of the ZV-E10 Mark II, a very, very compact camera. I found that this lens mounted on it was a really great match for that. The lens is 65mm in diameter, 2.6 inches, and only 54.7mm or 2.15 inches in overall length. It weighs in at just 171 grams or 6 ounces. In other words, for getting an 85mm angle of view, it's very hard to get that smaller and lighter than what you're going to get right here. This is a very lightweight and tough little lens. It has a 52mm front filter thread. It does include both a pouch and a lens hood, both things that are definitely not always expected on a lens with a price point this low. I will say about the lens hood that while it bayonets on fine, it doesn't really like lock click into place. And what I have found is that it is possible to bump that, and if you're not careful, because if it's off center a little bit, it will cause some shading, some mechanical vignette. So you're going to want to be careful about that, but at least it is included here along with a little pouch for it. There are no features on the barrel here, no switches, there's no aperture ring or anything like that. All we've got is a manual focus ring. Manual focus here does actually have a nice level of damping. It feels fairly good. What you will find, however, is that doing like large focus changes takes a number of rotations. So I find it better for fine-tuning focus, but it is, I think, good enough, has good enough feel that if you wanted to do some manual focus pulls, I think you could pull that off for video work. Inside, we have a very decent 9 aperture blade, so the aperture iris stays a little bit more round than a more typical, say, 7 aperture blades for cheaper lenses. So a little bit of a minor upgrade there. A Viltrox consistent feature is that there is a USB-C port on the lens mount, which, by the way, is my preferred position for it. So you're not messing with some little port that has a cover that you can lose. Instead, it's right there where it's typically covered up by the connection to the camera or the lens cap, and so you're not going to have to worry about any kind of moisture getting into that. But Viltrox firmware updates are really, really simple to do. It's basically just a drag and drop. You do have to have a computer typically, but outside of that, it's very, very easy to accomplish. Now, I did note one change, that on paper, the specifications for minimum focus distance is the same. It's rated at 55 centimeters and only 0.11 times magnification. Not great. But what I actually found is that on Sony, I seem to be able to focus a little bit closer, and I also seem to be able to get a higher magnification level than what I did on Fuji. In fact, I was comparing it to a full frame 85mm lens that has a supposed magnification of 0.12 times. And as you can see here, the Viltrox very noticeably showed a much higher level of magnification. I'm going to guess on Sony this actually plays out at 0.14 times, at least if you manually focus. And so again, just a little bit more useful here on Sony. There is no weather sealing on these inexpensive lenses, but what you do get is what they call their HD Nano multi-layer coating on the front element. It does help a little bit with cleaning, kind of an anti-fouling, anti-fingerprint, and so some nod toward that, even if there's no actual weather sealing here. Overall, there's not really any bells and whistles, but it's also, you know, 180 bucks or less. It's actually a really nicely made lens that feels tough, feels durable, and as we're going to see, is very high performing. Now, a lot of my chief objections when it came to the Fuji version of the Viltrox 56mm f1.7 was when it came to autofocus. Now, on Sony, I fully expected that autofocus would be much better, and it, if anything, has exceeded my expectations. We have a lead screw type STM focus motor, and while it was quiet on Fuji, it was a little bit on the slower side, kind of slightly below average. On Sony, it seems to be considerably above average, and as you can see here, those focus changes, either indoors or outdoors, are pretty instantaneous. I also found that it did a very good job of tracking the eye, and that was true not just in my kind of formal test here, but if I was you know, shooting animals, birds, insects, I found that the eye AF tracking was actually really good. I was even able to catch a bee in flight, which I'm definitely not able to do with every lens. So an impressive result there. I also found, for example, that now because there's so much more speed, and this series of Nala moving persistently towards me, autofocus stayed moving ahead and on track throughout the whole sequence, about a 40-shot burst. So that in itself is impressive because that's not often been the case with inexpensive lenses. I also found that catching birds in flight was actually quite easy, both to acquire them and then also to track them. I had really great results there. And so autofocus is the kind of autofocus that you can do as far as your subjects now include action, and there's not really much you can't do with this lens, which is fantastic. I even found in very low light, I was testing on the ZVE10 Mark II to see how its low light performance was, and even shooting in basically a dark room, ISO 32,000, I was able to get accurate autofocus, and so no issues there. Focus didn't even seem to slow down all that noticeably, and so just really impressed with autofocus for stills. I was really unimpressed with autofocus for video on Fuji, but again, it has so much to do with Fuji's autofocus system, which is in desperate need of updating, unfortunately. And so on Sony here, autofocus pulls for video, even in this challenging subject, were really fantastic. And it's challenging because it's a dark subject in not a particularly well-lit area. But you can see that focus is just confidently moving to the background, back to the subject without any kind of pulsing or settling, no issues there. When I shot my hand test, that was an area that, again, didn't go great on Fuji, but here on Sony, you can see that those transitions from my hand to my eye and vice versa, they're very, very confident. There's zero issues there, and so a great result there. Now, when it comes to just normal shots, I'm not gonna say that it's like super cinematic, but neither are the focus transitions really abrupt or noticeable. They're not totally damped, but they're good enough. And you'll also note that focus breathing is fairly low on this lens for being a longer focal length, and so that helps as well. There's just kind of less of that kind of jarring forward or backwards, but rather transitions are rather smooth. So overall, I would say that this autofocus system is now pretty fantastic, at least on Sony, able to accept a lot of different challenging subjects and for both stills and video, so great results there. Now on the image quality side of things, here's an area where I knew that we would have an easier ride on Sony than what we did on Fuji. Part of that is just practically there is no camera system that I test that is demanding as Fuji's 40 megapixel X-Trans sensor. That is huge pixel density that far exceeds anything from any other brand at this point. And so with Sony having a threshold of just 26 megapixels, and the fact that most pieces of software have an easier time with sharpening and demosaicing on Sony than they do on Fuji X-Trans, it just makes for a simpler process. And so this is an optical formula of 11 elements in 9 groups. Surprisingly, for such an inexpensive lens, 7 of those are exotic elements, including extra low dispersion elements, high refractive index elements, and so it's quite an impressive little optical formula, which shows part of why it's so sharp. The MTF, as you can see, is just really remarkably consistent. It actually is a little bit sharper, slightly off axis than what it is in the dead center of the frame, but it's also just surprisingly sharp even over onto the corners. And what I found is that when shooting big images where I was looking even towards the very edges, looking at fine details, they were just really, really nicely resolved. It's very rare for a lens this inexpensive to resolve fine details as well as what this Viltrox 56mm does. And so what you're going to find is in terms of some of the technical things, and by the way, I'll give you just a quick technical overview, and then if you want the technical deep dive, you can stay tuned to the end of the video and we will explore that together. But distortion, as I saw on Fuji, is very low. I registered a -2 of a pincushion style distortion. Really not enough to mess with in most situations. In fact, if you're shooting portraits, leave it uncorrected. It's a little bit more flattering to portrait subjects. It makes them look a little bit thinner, which they're typically happy about. But also in this case, as is almost always the case with these third-party lenses, when I compare a Sony E mount to a Fuji X mount, there's less vignette for some reason on Sony. And so in this case, that is true. The vignette is, I needed a +41 to correct as compared to a +73 on Fuji. So almost a stop less on Sony, which is pretty consistent with what I typically see. So now vignette is less of an issue as well. I also saw a consistency between Sony or Fuji mounts in that fringing is quite low, whether that's the longitudinal style. You can see on my chart that there's really not a lot of fringing there, and then out in the real world, in this shot, for example, of flower petals, there's very little fringing around them, so that's good. Also in an f8 example from my test chart in the corners, there's very little fringing there, lateral style chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame, so very well corrected in that regard as well. All of that adds up to really excellent wide open sharpness. And as you can see here, the lens is very consistently sharp in the crops these are 200% crops. It's sharp center, mid-frame even better, and then right into the corners. Very, very consistently good. So awesome in that regard. You will find you'll get a slight contrast boost as you stop things down. So a little bit better at f2, better still at f2.8. From f2.8 to f8, it's more about depth of field. It's less about more resolution and sharpness because it's pretty much pegged it already. And so you can just control aperture for your depth of field, but you're going to have plenty of sharpness there. And by the way, that makes this lens really valuable as a lightweight nighttime lens to go out with. It's reasonably bright at f1.7, very small and discreet. And because it's so sharp, even at f1.7, you can get some really great looking images. As per usual, diffraction will start to show up around f11. It's a little bit less noticeable on this lower resolution camera, though by f16, which is minimum aperture, it will be the softest image quality that you're going to see throughout the aperture range. I found that colors are really good, and this is one area where things have really improved. If you go back to the 56mm f1.4, kind of Viltrox's more first generation of lens design, the optical glass didn't overly impress me at that point. But what I have found is that the quality of their optical glass has gotten a lot better. And with it, colors are just a lot better. They're less garish, they're more natural, more neutral in terms of the overall color tone. And thus, I'm actually really pleased with the overall look of images. Bokeh quality is good. Now, it's not going to be like full frame 85mm f1.4 good, but I did find that the quality of the blur is reasonably good. There's not a lot of hard edges. A little bit more outlining than what I would like, but not particularly strong. And so overall, I found that a lot of my images just had a really nice overall look to them. And again, for the price of the lens, it's a really strong performance there. Even flare resistance is reasonably good, not perfect, but again, good enough to get by. And so overall, there's really not a whole lot to complain about optically here. So in conclusion, I liked this lens a lot on Fuji, despite the autofocus limitations. But on Sony, if you're on a budget, this is pretty much a dream. To be able to get such a high-performing lens for such a low price makes this kind of a no-brainer if you're a Sony APS-C shooter and you're looking for just a good quality lens to throw on your camera. It's very sharp. It's comparable to the Sigma 56mm f1.4 in sharpness, and the bokeh quality is, if anything, maybe a hair better. And so it really provides a pretty strong value alternative if you don't need to go all the way to f1.4 and thus spend the extra money for the Sigma, which is also an excellent lens, by the way. So I would say that I don't know of a better budget portrait lens on Sony APS-C than the Viltrox AF 56mm f1.7. It is pretty much a joy to use. Now, if you want more information, you can either check out my full text review, which is linked in the description down below. There's also linkage to an image gallery and some buying links if you'd like to purchase one yourself, including a discount code that may get you money off. Kind of Viltrox is a little up and down with that, but give it a try. Beyond that, if you want a deeper dive into the overall performance of the lens, stay tuned right now and we'll take a look at that together. Okay, we'll start by taking a look at something that you can't do on Fuji X mount since it only is APS-C. This Sony E-mount obviously is either APS-C or full frame. So if we put this on a full frame camera, this is what we get. And so you can see that no, it is not giving full frame coverage. However, if I crop that image we just looked at here and then I shot just in APS-C mode, you can see if I cycle here into the pixel dimensions, you can see that there is considerably more pixels left over than the standard 26 megapixels of the APS-C crop mode. In fact, if I did the math, this is about 35 megapixels worth of resolution. So obviously you are going to be able to get more on frame than what you are by shooting in pure APS-C mode. And so, I mean, it might be advantageous just to be able to get that extra amount of information on frame for you in a particular situation. Second thing here is vignette and distortion. So taking a closer look at this, you can see there is a little bit of a pinch here in the center of the frame, pincushion distortion. It's extremely mild, very easily correctable. I used just a -2 to correct that. You can also see that there is some definite vignette that is there in the corners. But again, it's not significant. A +41 to correct, that's between a stop and a half. And so it's not super bad, and you can see it corrected quite easily. Likewise here with longitudinal chromatic aberrations, you can see looking at this is the area of focus. So before the plane of focus, very, very tiny bit of magenta fringing. After plane of focus, a tiny bit of green fringing, but so minuscule that you really aren't going to see it much. This would be kind of a worst case scenario here, and you can see even at this distance that there's a tiny bit of fringing again around just some of those edges, but it's kind of a natural transition to the colors beyond. I didn't really see any kind of objectionable longitudinal chromatic aberrations in any real world shots. Likewise here with lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame, you can see all of our transitions from black to white are really nice and clean. There's no fringing that I see anywhere, so no issue there either. So here's the test chart. I'm shooting at 26 megapixels of resolution, which is currently the highest available on Sony APS-C. And you can see here, even at 200% magnification, which is how we'll look at our test chart, that we have very good sharpness and contrast in the center of the frame. But you'll notice that unusually, it's actually even better here in the mid frame. And that's what the MTF chart shows us as well, that this lens is one of the rare lenses. It's actually a little bit sharper off-center from the axis than what it is in the center of the frame. We can see very good consistency. You can see sharp here and right down into the corners and right out to the very edge of the frame. A very consistent sharpness and contrast there. That's a really excellent performance. We'll take a moment just to pop around to check out centering. You can see it's good here on the left side, towards the bottom, very good at the top. Actually, that's really fantastic looking up at the left top, and then up at the right top, it looks great here as well. So very consistent centering. So what all of that means is that you get excellent real-world performance even at f1.7. So if you're shooting portraits, you can see great detail, great skin tones. Everything looks really fantastic even at f1.7. Here, a shot of a seagull on the beach. And again, look at the amount of detail that's present there. Everything is very nice and crisp. This shot of bird in flight shows that it's able to give us, because of the good autofocus, very good detail and consistency even in this kind of setting. Now, you can see a tiny bit of magenta fringing along the edge of the wings there, but it's pretty minuscule and you could easily correct for that if so desired. Final thing here is I made the point about this being a great low light performer. And because it's so consistent right off to the edge of the frame, you really have the opportunity to shoot at f1.7 even in dim conditions and get really nicely detailed results without having to crank down the aperture to try to sharpen the lens up. Now, if we compare f1.7 to f2, so that mild little stop down, we can see that it does make a difference. You can definitely see some increased contrast that is present there. Already our mid-frame is excellent, and so it's just slightly more excellent. And down into the corners, again, corners were already awesome, but you can just see that there is a bit more contrast and overall pop to the textures that is present there. Now, one of the primary things you see stopping down to f2.8 here on the right is just that the vignette issues near the edge of the frame, what was there, are lifting, and so just the image overall is brighter, and so that just allows us to have a slightly more consistent end result to where it just looks very, very crisp. Look at the stamping of the letters here; it really stands out against it. You can just see here that the contrast is a little bit more muted at f2, so that's the improvement of shooting at f2.8. Now, once you hit f2.8, you're really not going to sharpen up much from there. We can see here with f4 on the right, really not improved. And even if we compare f5.6 now on the right, it's really not any better either. It's more that it just kind of holds its own. And so it's really consistently good. But I would say, if anything, there's a mild drop off from f2.8, which seems to be pretty much peak performance here in my eye. So here's a shot on the ZVE10 Mark II. This is a JPEG image right out of camera. And so you can see, looking at f5.6 landscape aperture, you've got sharpness right there into the very, very corners of the frame. Very, very consistent performance here. And so we can see, as we look towards the future, lots of details that are shown there and off into the distance. Just really fantastic detail. This is an easy lens to carry, small and light. And I've looked at this image already previously. It really impresses me with how much detail is present there all throughout this frame. If you look at the fine details, they're really resolved. Look at all these trees through this zone. It's really quite impressive to see just how much detail is present there. So by the time you get to f11, the image quality is only very slightly softened by diffraction. By the time you get to the minimum aperture of f16, you can see that it's the softest that we've seen at any point. Diffraction is just robbing some of the contrast and detail there. So we've had a bit of a discussion about how that magnification does seem to be improved here on E-mount. This is the area that I focused on. You can see even up close, very good sharpness and contrast there. And so, and again, it goes right off to the very edge of the frame. So overall, this is a good performer up close as well. As mentioned previously, I think that the bokeh quality is it's not high-end level, but it's good. I mean, there's nothing really objectionable in the shot. You will see a little bit of that deformation of the specular highlights, a little bit more like lemon shape towards the corners, but that's pretty typical. And overall, if you look at the overall, just quality of the image. This is a raw image right out of camera. You can see that the colors look good, detail and contrast look good. Really nothing to complain about. This shot, even in the midst of a burst of Nala moving towards the camera, you can see that really sharp delineation in the plane of focus, really nice and sharp and contrasty. But then as we look towards the background here, you can see the background is reasonably soft, a little bit of outlining here. But again, this is an inexpensive lens, and that's a pretty great looking end result. Another shot here, and again, colors look good, detail is good, and then the overall quality of the blur, not bad at all. So really, this is a pretty strong performance all across the board, and really impressive when you consider the price point of the lens. So as always, thanks for sticking around to the very end, and I hope that the optical deep dive has answered any lingering questions that you might have had about the performance of the lens. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.